he's really he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, a moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
So today we are looking at the book called They, They. I'm spelling that out because people might like mishear it as something else. And this is by K. Dick, who is a woman, lesbian woman. It's not Philip K. Dick, it's just K. Dick.
Didn't she identify more as like a bisexual than a lesbian?
Okay, bisexual. Well,
I don't know.
Babe,
did you read the afterwards of this book?
I didn't actually. But what's in the afterword?
Oh, the afterword, because the narrator of the book is quite it's kind of hard to tell if like it's a man or a woman narrator, and then the afterword like goes into how like that's probably deliberate because it wanted to be like an androgynous type narrative style because she was bisexual, and that was sort of emblematic of that.
Because I don't think my edition has an afterword.
Well, the edition I've got is the
with Carmen Maria Machado.
I can't remember who.
That was the preface.
Oh, I don't have an afterword either in my edition.
Well, I think mine's I've got like a Kindle edition, and I think it's just been republished like this year or like a few months ago by not that
Faber.
No, it's not Faber. Yeah. It's just I can't remember the publisher, but they've really published like a number of like British things. If for some reason they're also like republishing, they almost look like a fake publisher because they're the ones that are republishing a section from David Foster Wallace's The Pale King, and are trying to palm it off as being a like new writing of his, even though it's just a section that's been taken from The Pale King and is like was supposed to be like originally published as a novella, but was put in the edited version of the novel after he died. But then I'll palm it off as a new book.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Yeah.
And also the female voice you heard before was Sheila Ngoc Pham, who I should have introduced, but she is our guest today. Hi, Sheila. Welcome.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Reuben.
Hey.
We're very informal here.
Friend of the podcast.
A friend of the podcast. Definitely. Remember when I had that whole rant about there should be like a Nicene Creed for podcasting and like determining who should be like considered how you get the status as friend of the pod?
Yeah, we should. We should have that like on a table somewhere, and people can get in and out of being friends of the podcast, and we can have like enemies of the podcast as well,
and frenemies of the podcast. But Sheila very much so is a friend of the pod. It's one of those things like it's like pornography. You know it when you see it. Like you don't need like a framework. Yes. So Sheila, welcome. Welcome to this mess of an introduction and podcast. Basically, I know Sheila. We met online, I think, on Twitter, and we're both of a similar age. We're both geriatric millennials. But Sheila, what are you all about? Tell us about yourself.
This is the question.
Let the people know
answering.
who you are.
I mean, I dread answering this question because my life is just so strange to explain to people. But I guess but the best way to describe myself. So I'm Sheila Ngoc Pham, and I said that with Vietnamese pronunciation because that's my cultural background. But yeah, I guess in terms of...
I pronounced it right without even asking you. So
yeah, well done. Yeah. Although I'm not precious about the way people pronounce it. There's a lot of discourse around getting things wrong, but I mean, it's a difficult language, Vietnamese. So I mean, if you get it in close, I'm happy with that. But my background is I'm a writer, editor, but I also do lots of other things too. So I produce podcasts, radio documentaries. I'm currently writing a stage play. I've written a few short plays before. Yeah, I'm doing a PhD in women's health and lecture in public health ethics. I collaborate with arts and cultural institutions, and yeah, I'm kind of just around. I think I'm this omnipresent person doing stuff around Western Sydney, it seems.
And you're raising two kids too. This woman is a superwoman.
Well, yeah, there is a cost to that. Like, I do suffer from insomnia of late. I'm like, I think I've got a bit too much going on. But yeah, but I guess in general, I suppose like identify as working kind of in the media, the arts, and in health as well.
Beautiful. Okay, so yeah, they. So this, I picked this up mostly because of the story behind how it came to be republished. It was first published in the 70s, 1977 to be precise, I think. And it is a sort of, it's called They, and then the kind of subtitle is A Sequence of Unease, which is just like a brilliant subtitle that kind of like just really conveys what this is all about. So basically, this was published, didn't sell many copies in the 70s, and then it was sort of found in a used bookstore by an agent who was like, this is fucking awesome, let's republish this. And so that agent got it published again. And yeah, it's a very short kind of, I don't know if you would call it a novel, novella, short story cycle or something like that. It kind of defies categorization in that way. But it basically follows kind of a series of characters as they're haunted by this group called, that is known only as They. And it's sort of like just sort of a group that targets artists, writers, creative people, craftsmen of all sorts, and like is trying to stop them from expressing themselves, expressing their individuality. And there's this sort of looming presence of they or them, they, them, and they kind of come in.
Joke.
they kind of come in and sort of like invade. It's set basically in the countryside, the English countryside. They come in and basically hover and like, at first it starts with surveillance, looking to see if people are expressing themselves too much, and then it kind of escalates to like violence and murder and things like that. So it's really kind of, it's called a dystopian kind of book, and I can kind of see that why you would call it that, but it's sort of like that whole idea of unease, like gives me a sort of like, it's almost like a fever dream as well, like the way that it describes these people that are kind of looming and threatening.
That was how I saw the book described, as being like dream sequences, and I was like, I kind of like, that wasn't initially how I read it, but like, I feel like if you go back and like look through it, the way even though the chapters are sort of like interconnected, this is like, I feel like I don't actually know if there's like a criticism of the book or not, but like each chapter is, I don't know if it's from the same narrator or not, but like all the characters are different, but they're kind of variations on the exact same characters every single time. There's like always a dog. There's always these like artist friends who are getting in trouble for painting too much.
Children.
Specifically, like children. It's usually the same sort of variation on a very similar plot structure, like they're being sort of slowly taken over by them, and slowly getting their like book stolen and painting stolen or whatever. And I feel like if it was like any longer than it would be, I feel like it would have probably gone on my nerves like slightly too much. But it's like, it's very short. It's only like 100 or so pages or something.
Yeah,
probably less than that really. It's not very long. I feel like it definitely gives that sort of that slow creeping unease as well, where like it gets slightly more uneasy every single section, even though it's just a slight variation on it, until it gets to sort of the end of it, where I guess you get that sort of much more like sort of, end of a dream type thing. Right?
Yeah, the book evokes like, I think unease is the problem. I mean, it is the subtitle, and basically does describe the mood of the whole book. And just to go back to what you were saying earlier, Matt, I mean, it is described as dystopian, and it definitely has like these kind of Cold War vibes, I guess. It's a book of the 70s, which I really enjoyed. Like, I feel like it seems so quaint now, the fears of the 70s, compared to just how ugly the world got in a lot of ways in the next few decades. But I think I read it quite differently too, because when I read it, I kind of read it as like a book that I related to in a very concrete way. So to me, this is like the present. This is what it is like in some of the things that I've experienced over the last few years as a writer. And so it's not that dystopian in a way, which I don't know what it says about the reality that I exist in. But I think that constant feeling of that surveillance and that pressure, and ultimately, and I guess we can talk more about it during the podcast, but in a way, like the book talks about how it doesn't matter who they are. They're like, I think that they're described as self-renewing. it's like that they're a presence. And it's the same with, I guess, all the artists and the friends. They're interchangeable in a way. We're all kind of like these self-renewing, properties in a way, like, because it's more about like a dynamic that's being perpetuated in the book.
And you get that that dynamic in like a pretty like comic scene where they're like, they do these like vast sort of like exercises or something, like up and down this hill with these giant poles. This is like perfectly symmetrical in every single like thing they do, and the people like have to like walk through them doing it and try not to get hit by them. So like, as long as they don't disrupt the symmetry, as long as they don't disrupt the order of the exercise, then it's like, that's fine. You can keep going on and stuff.
It's very militaristic, I think.
But also like it seems like very decentered as well. That's kind of adds to the sort of dread of the they thems. I'm going to keep doing that. Sorry. Is that they're kind of like organized, but sort of disorganized at the same time. And like they go around barefoot, so you don't hear them. So you get the sense that they're kind of disheveled as well. Like they're just sort of like shambling around. And so there's there's this tension. And I think that's very much on purpose. Like, they could be anyone sort of thing, but they're also readily identifiable. But it's funny. Yeah, it's funny, Sheila, you mentioned about like this being a book of the 70s. Nowhere is that more apparent than like all the complaints about television.
Oh my God. I laughed so hard.
My sweet summer child. Like,
I know, that's why. I mean, it's so quaint. Like, I mean, and of course, like, so I think it's interesting because TV would have been introduced about 20 years before this, right? So 1956, around that time. And so then, at the beginning, it's a novelty. And everyone has like really like high hopes for it. And it reminded me of like the early internet. That's what it was like. We were like, yeah, this is great. And then by about 20 years in, then everyone's like, oh, this is just an idiot box. We're turning into zombies. And it made me think about the internet. Like Matt and I have talked about this in offline or online rather, about, the way the early internet was kind of very different as well. And it made me think about how the 70s though, this is about the Cold War, and it's also about communism, I felt too. So that's how another kind of thing I was reading when I was reading it. It made me think of a film, I don't know if you've seen it, called After Image. It was about a Polish painter, a famous biopic that came out, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. But it's also about how this man tried to be an artist under communism, and then slowly, like he basically lost opportunities and was crushed and like starved. And so I felt like there was a real kind of commentary on what it was like in the 70s when people were awakening to the horrors of communism as well, the worst aspects of it. Because, the first couple of decades, people were just apologists for communism for ages too. They didn't want to know what was happening in Mao's China or behind the Iron Curtain in Russia. So but it's not as like politically simple as that. I think obviously it's perpetuated by all sides of politics, this sort of behavior. But I definitely felt like the other thing is it's not just about artists, because there's even a reference to a farmer where he gets into trouble for not wanting to farm the new ways, which is probably like DDT and all that sort of stuff. And so, he's like a classic organic farmer and he gets into trouble. So there's just a passing comment. So it just made me think of like a real 70s consciousness when you read the book. And I guess it is it is a kind of queer novel in a true sense is how I felt about it. And even that rejection of like, wanting to be coupled up or married or living with a family unit. Which I found kind of interesting because in a way that future is here too. And that's kind of a dystopian reality we live in, that a lot of people live on their own. And that's actually not a desirable thing. But in the 70s, it was also a stance of trying to have some individuality.
Well, I would say, I would say that the like being alone, being your own sort of unit is, I wouldn't say it's desirable, but it's just sort of almost accepted and the norm now, like in a way that it probably wouldn't have been back then. So, and that's why like it's not just like single people who live by themselves are kind of grouped in with the creative people, the craftsmen and all that sort of stuff as well. So,
but even in the novel though, it's not like as though like all these characters are like literally living by themselves, isolated, like they're misanthropic or anything like that. They're like, they have those much more, I guess, to use like queer in that term, like family relationships, right? Like their family are their friends who they will like constantly see each other and all that sort of stuff. They just like prefer to like reject like the quite like solidity of, I guess, a not traditional family home or something like that, maybe. But I like the reference to like that sort of communist aesthetic, particularly that sort of Russian modernist sort of technocratic aesthetic as well, which like definitely gets like put into the book, like the all these towers and all these new buildings don't have windows, and like there's a scene of like an architect, but like the architect is like hired to try and figure out a way to still get light into a building without windows or anything. And like the same with the like all they have is television and no windows. Like there's a scene like near the end of the book as well where like as a small act of rebellion against one of these towers, they're like slowly like sort of palming against the wall so they can maybe slightly get some light in. There's a scene, I think it's near the end of the book, in the last chapter, where one of the characters says, the sightseers, like basically them, prefer concrete. Think of their passion for mariners, not for the boats, but for the car parks, the amusement arcades, the proliferation of restaurants and blocks of high tower apartments. They like to see the sea pulverized out of its natural area by concrete. They dislike the beaches for the same reasons. Bathing in the sea is too uneasy a freedom. They prefer swimming pools. They like nothing better than to sit in their cars and look at the sea from the safe harbor of a monstrous mariner complex. And like particularly how like having a garden would be like the biggest trap, because it's like the garden is beauty, is sensuality, is mystery, is imagination. So anything that like conjures mystery or ambiguity, or like any of the things that we associate with beauty have to be sort of eradicated, because they are things that the technocratic sensibility can't predict or can't actually understand or anything like that. Like the another book that sort of I got reminded of, even though it's a very different book, is like Andrei Platonov's The Foundation Pit. Building around these like building of these like impossible towers, right? Like just concrete over concrete over concrete, that consistently must be built for the service of ambiguous they who never actually really sort of exist, right?
Yeah, and that could also sort of be read as like the whole, kind of Britain having lots of sort of social housing and things like that, and a lot of that going up in the 70s too.
And this is also like this is pre-Thatcher, right? So this is in that sort of period of British history, where there's like a lot of like strikes, like mining strikes, and like union movement, is sort of the economy is like breaking down. It's like a very like the lights are turning off in that sense.
Yeah, and when you think of England in that time, well, in general, but in that time especially, you just think of greyness.
You think of like the American Empire has taken over. Britain is like basically like dead in terms of like historical significance, and they are sort of fading out of relevancy, right? And that sort of, but yeah, it's greyness, right?
I think I really like an account. I don't know if you've read Nick Hornby's memoir, Fever Pitch. He talks a lot about, because he grows up in the 70s, and how grey England seems compared to America when you watch it through TV, and it just seems so like Technicolor. And I think if you think about the 70s, you're right. Like I was just looking up then, but like Grenfell Tower, for example, the one that burned, was built in 1974. So this is around that time, and I guess I can think about other buildings through England and Scotland that like really ugly, tower blocks that were social housing. But I guess the thing about Kate Dick, though, because I thought about that as well, because I was thinking she would have hated a lot of what Australia looks like in the cities. It's just like, swimming pools and just like shopping centres and that. But she also, I guess, because of her, she was born in 1915, so she, even by the 70s, she was already kind of older. And so in the book, you really feel like she's kind of defending quite a traditional idea of art as well, and beauty. Like she, she has quite an idea of like canonical work. So there's a lot of references to, Keats or,
Yeats,
Henry James and all that. And so I mean, which is fine. I mean, I understood what she was doing there, but I thought that probably reflected her own thinking about, what she thought was worth defending, and like what was kind of good art, I suppose. Did you get that as well?
Yeah. And that's an interesting tension I found, maybe not so much in the book itself, but the marketing around it, particularly the introduction by, what's her name? Carmen
Maria Machado.
Machado, who like, she made it's not a very long introduction, but she made like this big like song and dance about like how she was a queer, bisexual, radical woman. And like, when you read the book, like this does read like a kind of Roger Scruton fucking Tory, like lamenting the ugliness of modernity and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, just because she's bisexual doesn't mean she was like politically radical. Like it seems to me like a very much like return with a V to tradition kind of book, and like how almost they can be kind of seen as like this symbol of modernity and like the beginnings of neoliberalism and all that sort of shit, like kind of encroaching onto the countryside. Like, or it's almost like the orcs in Tolkien and things like that, because Tolkien really like idealized the countryside as well and was was more conservative in his outlook. So it's like, it was interesting to read like how, and people like Margaret Atwood kind of love the book as well, how they kind of almost gloss over the conservative side to this critique by saying, oh, she was bisexual, so therefore radical.
Yeah, but to be fair, I think the genius of the book is you can read it different ways. Like, I was reading it quite closely, so I did notice like, talk about Dead White Men, which is fine. I read Dead White Men too, but aside from George Eliot, I think all the works that get cited are basically by men. So quite traditional kind of works of art that are, we would still, to some extent see them as like quite canonical. Whereas, during the 70s, you think that's such a radical time. Like, where are the, citing of other kinds of texts that, anything from the last 50 years before that, for example. But there isn't much of that. So I think that probably reflects her own sensibility. And she would have been in her 60s, basically, early 60s, writing this book. And someone who I guess had been quite involved with literature in a traditional sense as well.
Yeah, she was an editor for George Orwell.
When
she was
I feel like I don't really interesting to actually hear like what our actual like politics would have been and stuff as well, just sort of to have some context. But it's just like in that literary context, I feel like that's that could also just be like part of like whatever the book's like sort of just aesthetic structure is doing as well. Like these are the names that people will sort of recognize more, and like these are the symbols of that kind of thing. Like the afterword to my edition, I feel like I figured out now like I think the two editions that got reprinted at the same time. So there's the Faber and Faber UK edition with the Mikado introduction at the start, and then there's the US edition, which is by McNally Editions, which is like reprinted like a bunch of different books in the last year. And it has an afterword by Lucy Scholes, who is must have been like is one of the editors of McNally. In that introduction, she afterwards she like mentions a number of different sort of more British female avant-garde writers from the time as well, like Anne Quinn. Like Christine Brooke Rose as well. And that sort of tradition as well that she's working in, and that the book itself sort of marks a kind of a radical disconnect between her earlier work, which is like much more classically like sort of Proustian, and this is sort of like a weird sort of late stage work as well. So like maybe there's like tensions in there as well about like how one is actually supposed to position oneself as a writer, like within these like sort of like more political movements as well, and how one is like supposed to deal with that. And I think that like, even in the time itself, like I was like just thinking around this emphasis upon like tower blocks and like concrete and stuff. Like J.G. Ballard's High Rise comes out like in 1975 as well, like 2 years before that, and like even like Concrete Island around the same sort of time. So like it's definitely sort of working within that very contemporary British tradition of being sort of worried about the way that sort of like capitalism and I guess communism as well to a certain extent have become like these weird sort of leveling functions as well. And like that's the capitalist force is like sort of denuding like art as well in that sense. And it's only that sort of like that classical sort of like tradition thing that Matt mentioned that maybe it's like that ballast against capitalist or non-capitalist art. It's like in the past, and this like sort of weird thing that these art forms could arise outside of that sort of capitalist structure, which I feel like is sort of a myth. Anyway, right?
Because she's got like signifiers of communism with all the like grey buildings and all that sort of stuff and the conformity. But then
that's also like that's a critique of capitalism all at the same time, right?
Well, yeah, like
and consumerism too, I think.
Consumerism,
yeah,
right? Like
also,
those two things I feel like are quite interconnected. They use the same names to predict them.
But they're interconnected. Like there's an argument you could make that like all the social welfare and stuff that happened in the West is particularly in the US, to a lesser extent in like the Commonwealth countries, was almost a response to the Soviet Union, because it was like, see, we can look after poor people too. Well, like
in the UK, like the rise of like basically like capitalist socialism in the 50s and 60s and 70s, like that was functionally that form, right?
So, but what I'm saying.
Ruin up that up.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is that like you've got those signifiers that like kind of are more towards the the Eastern Bloc kind of countries, with those big fucking towers like in Bulgaria and all those places. But then you've got pop music and television as the representation of like, capitalist societies and how they kind of level out everyone as well at the level of like, I don't know, cultural production or something like that. So, like, I think she's having a bit each way, right? Like it's not like, but she does use the tradition in the Return with the V sort of sense that I'm kind of that mentioned before as that. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, like the ballast for like these forces.
It's a very British thing to like. This is like, Sheila said before, this is a very British novel. It's not an American version of that myth. Partly because the American ideal of it is like the country house ideal, right? And it's that kind of return. Like these are people who go to their like country houses and have these sort of like great libraries and stuff like that. Which is very just not American, right? It's almost like even the writers who sort of like cites like James, Yeats, maybe Yeats to a lesser extent, but like James, like George Eliot, they very much they fit that aesthetic. It's not like she could have like picked like canonical writers from the same sort of, or it's like Conrad as well, of the same period who don't fit that aesthetic. It's like a very British understanding of it.
It made me think also a bit different, but there's some related themes. I was thinking about The Birds by Daphne du Maurier, which is published in the 50s, and really it's about World War II. But it made me think anyway, Kate Dick had also lived through World War II, presumably in Britain as well. So I think that sort of infuses the book as well. And so it was interesting reading it now that we've gone through like lockdown and a pandemic. There were sort of overtones of all of that too. But I guess the other thing, and this is just like projecting myself into it, but when I read this book though, it made me think that because apparently it is so different to her earlier work that in a way this must be quite a personal book. It's something she needs to get off her chest. And I guess I thought about that because I recently started writing this short story, and I do not actually write much fiction. It's not really my forte. But I also have been trying to deal with similar kinds of struggles, and I do occasionally like write an occasional essay dealing with these things directly. But even then, I don't want to fall in the trap of wasting all of my energy on, direct confrontation. I mean, and she kind of this is throughout the book as well about that, and wasting energy by talking directly to people or communicating, and all the people who are occupied that group, they never confront you directly. But it made me think that because of what I've been going through, I thought it must be stuff that she has experienced firsthand herself, and it must be something to do with her politics though, because I don't know and I haven't read up on her biography, but the fact that they signal that she's edited George Orwell probably does indicate something of her politics, if that's a signal. Like, someone like George Orwell, I guess, is like skeptical left. Someone who sort of stands apart is his kind of own person, and she's probably the same. She was probably someone like that.
The piece that, at least in the afterword that mentioned the Orwell things, that she commissioned or like published Orwell's essay on Wodehouse as well, and like the defense of that Wodehouse, his defense of Wodehouse, and that sort of that writing of the English upper class as being like worthy of something that you write about. So maybe that's also it's like it's a very particular kind of Orwell, right? It's not.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I hadn't kind of looked into like what was that, but just interesting by looking at her biography, how people want to write about it now, as you said, Matt. Because I guess we're looking at this now in the 2020s, and so then it's like because plenty of like upper class women relationships with other women too. It's not necessarily as radical as all that, but but in a way it's still radical. It's still not the norm, and like because she's a nonconformist essentially. I think that's kind of her politics, whatever however else you want to badge it. Because I felt that's why I read this, and I thought it was very personal. And because I could relate it to things that I had observed directly, it made me think that, it's like the same playbook that, even in Australia in the 2020s, similar things were happening. Like a friend, I was having dinner the other week, and a friend was telling me, and she's a writer, was telling me about this incident. And she was having dinner in Newtown, which is in the inner city of Sydney, and it's like this kind of, very vibrant, cafe district. And, if you know anything about Sydney, you know what that means. But basically, then there was these three young writers all wearing black. So there was just these three young writers in their 20s, and they basically kind of just stood there and stared at her, like staring her down while she's having, pasta or something with her husband, because they kind of operated a bit like thugs. They exactly like those characters in They. And I know exactly what she's talking about. We talked about these, young writers, because they basically don't really want to, they don't want to give people like me and her the freedom to write and think about whatever we want. So like people like us are nonconformists in our local writing scene, and so that's why I just felt reading that I thought I'm sure Kate Dick has probably seen and experienced this stuff firsthand, and it can't be a coincidence that 50 years later I'm like relating to this like very directly.
Did either of you read the sort of extend from that point? Did you read the obituary? That, the Guardian?
Put a pin in that because I want to go back to that because it's really good. But so can you give details about what the hell their problem with your friend was? Like, what's that issue here? Like,
yeah. So I mean, I don't know who's listening to this, but I assume that anyone who knows is probably not listening to this exactly. But basically, over the last 15 years, so I live and I grew up in an area in Sydney, which is known as Western Sydney for lack of a better expression, and it's basically like a
the Cumberland Plain is Max's.
Yeah, it's a suburban area, very mixed backgrounds. Traditionally it would have been quite like a white working class, area. It's become quite multicultural. And so about 15, 20 years ago, suddenly there are people with PhDs in literature, no offense to you, Reuben, I know you're doing a PhD in literature, suddenly taking note of this area and saying, oh, where are all the writers? And of course there are people who've come from this area who became writers, and depending on how you want to define the area, from Northwest Sydney for a time. Oh my God, who's the writer who's actually Patrick White? He grew up, he lived for a part of his life in some, in part of the area, but then later became very wealthy and lived in the inner city. But yeah, so then I think there was suddenly this kind of scene that developed, but it was basically driven by, people who had an interest in creating like this kind of new literature, essentially, and then encouraging these young writers who, might have been disenfranchised because of class and race and really wanted to push this, this kind of new wave of Australian writing. And so, there's something quite paternalistic about the whole thing. And I guess in my recent essay, which I think was quite widely read, which I called "Western Sydney is Dead, Long Live Western Sydney," I talked a bit about myself, and it's not like I even want to talk about myself, but I am in a unique position to talk about this as a witness. But I saw this happening. Like I was around at that time. I was in my mid-20s. But I'd kind of come up my own way because I'd come up through the internet, essentially. Like I'd learned how to read and write on my own terms. And then it was a bit odd to be told in my mid-20s that I, needed help from people who were, working in the English department at a university, for example. I was interested though. Like I wasn't not interested. But essentially, and that's the beginning of all of this. So this is really, over the last 15 years or so. And then over time, it's evolved into quite a conformist space in a different sense because one thing that happened too is that suddenly it became infected, I guess, with the politics of the day, which is these days it's very much around identity politics. It's very much about race. So, for example, in the early movement, there were heaps of young white writers who were involved, who were, in their 20s and also quite excited about being part of like this vanguard. And then at some point, it became more about like, oh, if you're white, you're a white supremacist. So then, you're out. And so people like Luke Carman got kicked out. And if you ever want to read about his account, I recommend it. It's called The Cult of Western Sydney. And people got very angry about that on Twitter, but I've read that twice. And to me, it sounds like a very accurate account of what happened, even though Luke himself, I think he's complicit in a way because he was also caught up with that early kind of fever. And so then, but it became quite thuggish, basically, the whole scene. So, I mean, I don't even mention names, but everyone knows what I'm talking about if you're sort of involved. They basically operate like people like they. That's exactly what they look like. They, wear black, they hang around, trying to intimidate people. And I felt it too, like about 6 years ago, it really flared up in a pretty ugly way at a writers' festival. And, there was a panel and one of the writers got attacked on the panel for being a white man. And that writer happens to be Marcus Zuzak, who is basically one of Australia's most successful novelists. When it came to Q&A, I just thought that what had happened was just wrong, essentially. And I knew that this was my moment, that I had to sort of take a stand in a quiet way. So I asked for the mic, and then I asked the question directed at Marcus Zuzak. So that's basically what triggered then my own sort of public kind of outing that I wasn't going to stand for this kind of thuggish behavior. And then it sort of set up a whole chain of events that for a time I really did think about also just like quitting. Like I thought, forget it. I'm just going to turn to screenwriting or something and get out of literary writing. The stakes are so small. It's not really like worth this. Like it's really pathetic. But then, but in the end, I guess over time, I decided, like, you know, and that's why this book really speaks to me in a very personal way, is that the only way to beat them is to basically survive and keep producing and keep making art. And so, I mean, the fact is, I basically got forced to become a good writer, essentially. And I really didn't think I wanted to be a writer. I was pretty ambivalent because, you know, I don't know, I feel like, especially like here, I'm like, I mean, sometimes I think the stakes are so small and the rewards are it's all pretty petty, really. It's very parochial here in Western Sydney as well, let alone Australia. But I really felt this sense of like that there was, you know, these people really wanted you to say a certain thing, to narrate the area in a certain way, to, you know, but I guess I basically have been able to circumvent that, but it's been pretty hard. Like, I have to be really clever. So when you read my writing, I have to be very careful about how I, you know, talk about my own politics, and also, make it hard for people to pin me down, essentially. Like, that's, you know, I'm being very honest here. This is exactly what's happened. That's why this book, if you want to understand anything about me, this book probably would give you an insight into my own psychology.
And which is funny because, like, I mean, I had a sense of this before I like asked you to read this book, but I hadn't actually read this book before I asked you to come on. So it's amazing how there's these little synchronicities, isn't there? But the thing,
also seems like the kind of book that I would have picked as well.
Yeah. The thing about this book as well that you mentioned as well, Sheila, is like outlasting them and all that sort of stuff. The thing that they do in this book, in terms of, like, you know, they're sort of like trying to move on, like to just sort of staying one step ahead of like the conformists and all that sort of stuff, so they can continue to like make art or preserve it or whatever for the next generations or whatever. But like, I read this and I'm like, yeah, I get that in the dystopian situation. I don't think we're quite there yet. And like, I really believe in confronting these people and not like, and confronting them openly and not like just, you know, everyone's mileage may vary, but like for a time I was like very much like the people in this book, you know, just like, oh, let's just go off and do our own thing. But like,
there are also like some, even within the book as well, there are like, it's not like a simple, you know, make art, resist.
Yeah.
Right. Like, to preserve art for the future. Like the way that the art is sometimes preserved is also like by complications or ambivalences, or there's this one of the earlier chapters where they're all sort of like for some reason, like the guy who owns the mill is like the protected guy because he has the grain and grain is life and stuff, and like inside the mill he's like been preserving like all this art. And these people are staying with him. And it's like, oh yeah, this is great. And then suddenly, like, these people like start, or they like come up to the building where the mill is and stuff. And like they suddenly realize that the only reason he's been able to preserve all the art is because he's like struck a deal with them, so that he'll give people to them, so long as like they don't touch the art and the thing. So he's basically just like, I feel like that's the publishers, right? In this allegory that we're building.
So yeah.
This is Giramondo.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And but the other thing I saw, there was kind of a few references to this too. I guess it's the role of the state and its encroachment into like private life and to, you know, your creative life as well. Because there's that story, which I thought was really like, it was such a good twist at there. And you're like, oh, but of course, you know, he's now one of them essentially. But it made me think even also of like, you know, there's the communes and they're kind of like, so it seems to me like it's not necessarily the state, but they're sanctioned by the state. And so I was asking my husband about this, who's a bit of an expert on, you know, what happened in China in the Cultural Revolution. And he said that's a similar thing that happened in China with the Red Guard and so, but then eventually, you know, they become the state as well. But it made me think of like arts funding, like there's that, the bit where, you know, people who want to live in the arts commune. But that's because like I guess you could otherwise have a more radical position of just not getting involved and really staying outside of all that and, you know, finding another way to support yourself. Like there's that, you know, and then even like there's that craftsman who basically is like building boats or something and he's just biding his time. He's doing it, but he's trying to be clever about it. But I guess I identify with a character like that more in the book too, where you sort of like, you're resisting in a way, but you're sort of also finding another means. So that's why my PhD is in healthcare. And I've got a job lined up soon. I'm going to be working 3 days a week, in sexual reproductive health. But then that way I can keep creating and I don't have to be dependent on, grant funding, for example,
Yeah.
to create. Although I'm applying for a grant now, but in general, I don't apply for many grants. I prefer to just kind of not get too closely involved, because once you do that, that's when you see. I think that's when it becomes a bit toxic. I see people, they're not independent anymore.
Yeah, that's what it always strikes me that I'm not sure if this is like more Australian than like, I'm not sure how like we work in other countries, but it seems like a very Australian desire. Like you see every time like grant, particularly, I see it more with like the ARC grants, like university like funding and research stuff, is that like every single time these rounds come around, and people are like, oh, why isn't the government like spending money here or here, or why didn't I get money for this, or why didn't I get grant money for this? And of course, the government's like very comic around this, because they'll just like cancel anything in relation to literary studies, which I always find like, yeah, go government. Like, I don't want this stuff funded. But it's like there's this belief that it's almost like it's pseudo paternalistic, right? It's like I must get money from the government, or the government must support something that I'm doing, or to validate me, I must be validated by like state power. Or if it's not state power, then it's like the funding body, who of course get that money from government anyway, right? It's very odd in this sort of like cloyingness towards. And then of course it inverts the work as well, right? Because then, as you said, like you have to like pitch the work towards doing that, and you go through like pitching workshops, like particularly for like research, and it's mind numbing, right? Yeah. And then they'll say like, well, maybe they should just change the pitch structure so that like it can work for the kind of stuff I do. I was like, that's not how it works. Like it's always gonna like, it'll always like meld itself around to these things around like productivity or whatever. Of course it should. Like I don't really know like what the issue is with that. Like what would be right?
The thing about like grants that I find like comical, but also really gets on my nerves sometimes. I don't know how like common, arts grants and stuff are in other countries, but like the way that people talk about it here, it's like crucial to the ecology, because like there's not enough people essentially to sustain an arts like kind of scene, apparently. So that's why people talk about like getting funding from the government so much. And the thing that like annoys me about it is that most of the people who are whinging about like not getting grants, or getting grants and not getting enough, not having enough opportunities to have grants in publishing or whatever other arts, is that they hate all of the people who are paying for this, which is like the Australian public, the taxpayers. And I'm like, it's so, like, I cannot believe the gall of these people. Like, all you do is complain about like everyday Australians, or, working class Australians and stuff like that. And they're footing the bill for your fucking like lesbian interpretive dance, no, shut up.
It's also, I feel like you can even map like a direct correlation towards those who really want arts funding, or who like complain about getting arts funding, or even those who get arts funding, and the worst artists in the country. Particularly like in a literary sense. I feel like if you like Joshua Cohen's joke about anyone who wins the Pulitzer Prize, that's like the death knell in your career, right? Of course,
then he won.
Then of course he wins the Pulitzer Prize. But like getting arts funding is the death knell for anyone's career in the arts, right?
I mean, I don't want to say, but just to declare, I don't want to say that all arts funding is bad. I don't think it's but somehow like
to its hyperbolic like ends, right?
Yeah, but you definitely see some people are better at getting grants than others, and they're not necessarily more deserving. So I think that is absolutely true.
They're better at writing grants. That's what they are.
There's a skill there, like bullshitting your way and getting the money in that, and so that's fine. Like
even like literary prizes and artistic prizes are also like they're grants as well, like to it's like sort of functional sense, and they work in that same.
Yeah, I mean, I've judged a few literary prizes recently, so I was a member of a couple of the non-fiction prizes as well as the multicultural one, and I guess I did it from my own education, and it was confronting because I read a lot of books, so that was good, being forced to read a lot of books. Although I wouldn't say I would naturally gravitate towards contemporary Australian writing at all, except for the fact that I was forced to. But I guess you see that these things are compromise choices anyway. I mean, there are plenty of deserving books that should be acknowledged and read. And I guess there's been a lot of Twitter activity recently about, I guess you probably have seen it, about how some books just don't get read. Apparently, get bought by 5 people or something, which I can totally believe as well. But just to go back to the broader point, though, around with the funding, I mean, I just want to make it clear for myself. I mean, I think the reason why I'm applying for funding now, which is pretty rare for me, it's more about me paying other people. And there's a kind of and I think some things do need arts funding because, so I'm applying for example, to write a play. And in fact, I'm happy to invest in my own time to write the play. And I guess if it came down to it, I would also use my own money to pay other people to get involved too. But given that the system does exist to support, like, works like this, I thought I would give it a crack. But yeah, but I have to say, yeah, part of me is uncomfortable with it on a personal level. I don't want to tell other people to live their life. Other people might be very comfortable applying for arts funding. I'm not. But I do want to pay people properly. I want to pay the actors properly. I want to pay the dramaturgs, all this sort of stuff. So that's where I think for these more kind of collective works, and there's something funny about this in the book too, this thing around individuality versus collectivity. Because I was thinking, I actually really like collaborating with other people and making work that way. But in this world, like that Kay Dick's writing about, she, I think, finds that, not what she wants, I guess. I don't know how else to say it, but, she's much more individualistic in her approach to creation. And she finds that those collectivist things, I guess it probably invokes that, communistic kind of feeling in her or something. Whereas but as someone creating work now, I actually think it's really healthy working with other people. I find that's something I did find a bit funny throughout the whole book, about this kind of push for individuality and this insistence on wanting to be by yourself. And like I said, we have this epidemic of loneliness in, society where everyone is on their own a bit too much. We need to be together a bit more. So that tension is really interesting, I think. But maybe the time she's talking about, and in England, it's a very different time. Like it's sort of hard to imagine exactly what it would have been like living in these small villages, I guess. Like I did struggle a little bit thinking, I understood from reading other works, but I guess I personally couldn't relate on that level about the kind of isolation of village life being desirable.
I guess there's also like because there's a tension there in the book as well about how what they want to sort of get rid of is communication as well. So they want you to be sort of like isolated within your sort of small unit or whatever it is. They want to sort of wipe out any sense of individuality or subjectivity. But so that almost you can't they want to eradicate communication or the idea of subjectivity so that you wouldn't have to communicate at all. If there's no subjectivity or there's no individuality, there's nothing to communicate, right? If everything's the same, what are you communicating? It's already there on the page, right? Or it's already there on the in the sensibility. So I guess here the art is seen as that attempt to actually communicate private feeling or private subjectivity in some sort of form. So it's in order to actually communicate, you have to be sort of alone with your thoughts or to understand your thoughts in that sense.
And she does
a Western ideal, though. Still, I think that's still to me that's very Western thinking of the world as well. But but the communication thing was interesting as well, because I think there is truth to that when I think about some of the thuggish behavior I've seen in recent years as well. I mean, that's what kind of public cancellations are kind of about. I mean, regardless of the actual stakes involved, because often these are no one really loses that much except for Twitter reputation or something. But often these things are not about communication. So I found that kind of accurate though in a way, because whenever I've seen an open letter, if you've seen some of those open letter canceling someone, who's been racist or something, or on Twitter, those kind of threads, they're not about communicating. I guess that's more about I don't know, writing a notice and sticking it with a knife into the the side of the church wall or something.
You have that in the book as well, where they it's the public notice or the notice, and in the book there are times where do not pass past this notice and stuff like that as well, and that's the signal. We're allowed to go into this area in the book. It's actually I don't know if we can, because there's a notice out the front of the thing that prevents us from doing that. So I guess
this book is a perfect allegory for social media, before social media even existed, because especially that scene towards the end where there's the three people on the rock, these sort of spectral forms of people who are intruding into your community or into your self-expression, things like that. So there's this tension in social media where you're invited constantly to express yourself in various different ways, which lends itself to a certain conception of individuality, right? Be yourself, share all this. I've talked and written about this at length, but then you get, especially once you get over a certain amount of followers, you have these spectral rapists who always have to have their little say and come into your mentions and things like that, where you haven't invited them. It's that, and what they're doing is they're trying to police your tone or correct you or something like that. And it's did I indicate that I was open to being corrected or my tone being policed? No, fuck off. So it's sort of interesting how, and maybe it just means I'm too online, but just how much I kind of sort of this resonated with like the experience of social media in 2022. Yeah. So that was an interesting kind of little, that made me even more kind of unsettled, actually. How do I avoid the bays?
Yeah, but I mean, I guess it's everywhere, right? And that's why it's not about individuals even, and that's why they're replaceable. It's just, that is what online culture is like, especially on places like Twitter and other similar places. But the other thing I want to get back to, you said earlier about you believe in confronting these things, but actually I've thought about this many times too over the years, believe me. I've thought of doing a massive public call out or something. But when I've talked to other people about it, people rightly pointed out that I would actually be bringing it on in terms of like I could be, victim of physical violence. Like that could actually happen. And maybe as a woman, experiencing some of this or observing it, I do have to be a bit mindful of, and careful around, especially like, I guess it's like toxic male anger, essentially, some of this stuff. And so it's not like that's why I had to learn to be really smart about it in the end, much more strategic with how I dealt with this, because, and as we know, I mean, where does calling out get you anyway in the end? Like,
yeah,
it doesn't go far.
I mean, like I wasn't critiquing you. I was talking about the book.
Oh yeah, I know.
Like,
but you saying earlier, yeah. But you saying earlier how you believe in this, naming these things, but it's quite hard to name it. That's why they're like this omnipresence. It's really hard to be specific about it.
Yeah, once you try to name it, the name then shifts as well, right?
Yes,
so there's never any stable ground to stay on. Right?
Yeah. Well, my preferred strategy would be like you confront it by basically sort of setting up parallel contexts where these people have no power over you, basically.
Well, that's what we ended up doing. I guess for lack of a better expression, we kind of took a bit of a feminist approach to it as well, because it was about creating alternatives, creating like a different kind of, scene within the same setting, basically, that had a different set of values. It was not about. Are you
saying you're a lesbian separatist, Sheila?
I wish I was that interesting. No, I'm very heteronormative in my behavior. But I guess I definitely felt like, but it was important in a way. Like, and that's when I did get involved. So that's one thing that did change. So for years and years, I saw this going on, and I was just keeping it at arm's length. I'm like, I don't want to get involved. I'm just going to do my own thing. But at some point, like about 6 years ago, I started to see people get really hurt by this and upset. So like really, like I've seen the abusive emails. That's why I do have all the receipts. I've seen the emails, the tweets where someone gets accused of being self-hating because they wrote something critical, or, really kind of nasty behavior. I know, like it's really pathetic stuff, but I mean, people shouldn't be subject to this kind of crap basically as well. I mean, it is part and parcel of, being a writer, but I don't know, like I've heard about people being bombarded with bad Goodreads like reviews and stuff like that. Like it just reminded me of that. And in the book, they talk about this too, like the kind of petty acts of vandalism, like that sort of stuff has been going on as well. But I guess I guess the only way to fight it is one to survive individually, which is kind of what I've been trying to do. But also, like you said, Matt, to like create like some kind of alternative. And that's when I got involved, and I knew I had to sort of make my stand. When the moment I asked that question to a white man instead of talking to the POCs on the panel, I knew that I had to sort of follow through with that, because ultimately for me it was a question of ethics as well. It wasn't even necessarily about me personally, but I knew it was about what kind of world did I want to live in. Did I want to live in a world where people should be free to like express themselves artistically in the ways that they would like to? And in that way, I would defend people from all politics, and it's not really about me personally. So that the stakes, if as minor as they are in this kind of local writing scene, they still matter, like it's still important. And so that's why I just had to get involved. Even though my inclination is also at the end of the day to sort of keep away from it and just do my own thing.
Yeah, and these things, like, you do say it's petty and it's parochial, but these things are playing out all over the world. Like and I think social media is like partially like a big factor in this. All the cancellations and the mobbings of people and things like that. But it happens every friggin' day in the US, for instance. Like, so yeah.
The best version of this as well, like in the book, or like to pinpoint like allegorical moments in the book, is that scene where I think it's one of the narrators anyway, or maybe they're the same narrator, is these two, like, this man and woman sort of like show up at his house, and they just sort of like invite themselves in, and they have like tea, and they just stay around, and they're like he keeps like she'll like the woman who's like they're supposed to be like part of the they as well. They do have names as well, which is odd because none of the other characters have names. And like she'll pick a flower, and the guy will come up to her and just like slap the flower out of her head and slap her. And then they'll like be like, "Oh, we'll have tea." It's like, "Oh, are you gonna stay the night?" "Yeah, we'll stay the night." And they end up just like fucking in his bed.
Yeah.
That's a good allegory, right? That's into your house. They just come into your house and they start like fucking each other in your bed, and then like beating each other up. And you're just sort of sitting there nodding your head quietly, offering them tea and biscuits. And
it's stuff. Basically the overfamiliar reply guy, like who comes into your mentions and like either like is or like sometimes the same one has got like the hots for you or really hates you like the next day or like things like that. Just really weird behavior like that. So yeah, she saw it all.
She saw it. I mean, that's what makes me. I mean, that's what's so fascinating about this book, though. I mean, I think that's why it is such a good read. I've been, raving about it to everyone, because I think it can be read in just so many different ways, depending, like on your own kind of experience. But especially if you are kind of involved, I guess, with the arts in some way, you should be able to recognize this. But I wonder, though, if the people who are perpetuating this kind of behavior, I don't know, if they would ever read a book like this, and one if they would recognize that they're the thugs. Like, I don't know that they necessarily understand this, because the thing that's complicated is, I mean, and I don't want to dehumanize some of these kind of young writers as well, but I think in their own way that they think that they're artists as well. Like, that's because they've been led to believe that, you can basically project into the world this vision of yourself as an artist, and that is how you become an artist. Because it made me think about, that thing about communication. So it made me think about what also became part of all this too was, so there's this young writer I was very friendly with, but then she got involved with the wrong crowd, I would say. But then at some point she started kind of ignoring me. And then I sensed it. Like, I sensed it for ages, like a year. And then I finally took the risk to communicate with her. I sent her a message. And I guess there must have been some still kind feeling in her heart that existed towards me that she actually bothered to reply. But it was a really shocking reply. Like, it really freaked me out, because I was like, oh, I've never seen someone get radicalized before. Like, I've never experienced someone joining a cult. But that's what it was like. But it was interesting because I guess I would never have heard otherwise, because communication channels get cut off, right? The moment you join a cult, it's not about communication. You basically close yourself off from talking and actually like conversing with people and trying to understand their perspective. And so that really pervades that kind of that feeling in the book too, which I had also experienced personally. And that's why I'm always like constantly like communicating. And I guess, but it made me think about the social media. I think my relationship to social media is that I basically treat it as like me constantly trying to assert myself and remind people that I'm out there doing stuff and, and being happy or whatever. And so it's a performance too. Like, and I think some people don't understand, and I've told people this, but because I have a kind of communications background, I understand what I'm doing. Like, that for me, this is also work. I essentially treat social media like a form of work as well. I don't treat it like some kind of pure channel of self-expression. I don't really kind of see it like that. But I guess that's the other way to win as well in the end. And I hate thinking about winning and losing like that, but that is the reality of, how do you deal with this atmosphere of like, the sequence of unease, and you see like incident after incident. And the only way to sort of really to try and thrive is to basically, try and be happy. Like, but that's what that's kind of where we are.
It relates back to the Stalinist context or the communist context of the book as well, right? And thinking about like writers in communist Russia at the time, like during the 70s and 60s, who were like the writers and artists who basically did just accept. Like, I feel like a lot of them managed to get out at some point, or like managed to get their work out as well. But then like a lot of them are just like working for the state, or like without working for the state as well, or just accepting the strictures on art placed under them, and like communicating in that way. But there's a good scene in the book where you get that sense that one of the issues is in a country like that is that even though you might still desire to communicate in some sort of way, to communicate is to open yourself up to danger, because you might be communicating with the wrong person. And there's a scene in the book where one of the children who's like going to school, and like her best friend's like gone away or something, or was just not there anymore. So she no longer has anyone to share secrets with. Right. And is having to like divulge her secrets with her like uncle or dad or something like that instead. And it's just not the same. Right. And because that's what that communication really is about, the ability to have secrets with people, to have channels of communication that aren't just like public or whatever. And what is like odd now is that so much of our secret communication like takes place in public on like social media as well, where it's like open to critique, it's open to being public, so it's not really secret at all. Like we have no more secrets, right?
But
like,
the truth,
secrecy is like that's the whole like idea of the internet, right? Secrecy is like abdicated.
But you say that, but then what's happened though, because of like basically messaging, there's a parallel kind of world that sort of there's a public world facing world, which is like social media, but then most of us are having the real conversation through DMs.
Yeah,
and then that's the back channel, and then that's why you have those actual communication. That's where real communication is occurring, not what you see on Twitter. That's just performance. So I think then, but it's interesting, what you're saying about the idea of secrets and trust, because it made me think about the Stasi as well. Actually, that was the other thing, another reference I was thinking of when the book, how basically people, you start to wonder, can I talk to anyone? And actually, and one other element I did like, which I wanted to mention, was I liked that there were these characters who were actually like kind of decent people, who were just like around, like who would give you a lift. Like that, like in that one, which I found the first time I found it really like freaky reading that book, the Fairing, that episode, where that she's trying to find that location, which was pretty much at the start, and she had to go all the way around and come back. But then she encounters friendly strangers who are actually trying to help her, because these people are not necessarily artists of any kind, but they're not necessarily like one of them either. They're just there to, they're just kind of decent people, and I think that's true as well when you think about what goes on in the world, that there's often this kind of quiet resistance of regular people who don't necessarily stand for this kind of behavior, but they don't necessarily, call out either. But they might try and quietly help, basically.
The Morrison's quiet Australians. Like this.
No, I don't want to say like that. But they're not those kinds of quiet Australians. But I like that character because he's just very careful about it. And even that doctor, I couldn't quite work out whether the doctor was one of those characters too, because they come and because they've hurt themselves. And then he said, be careful about, they've read their psychology books or something about accident prone. And I couldn't work out whether the doctor was, because it says something like it's a friendly warning. And I couldn't quite work out whether it meant that the doctor was complicit or otherwise the other way, where the doctor was just trying to protect them.
Yeah, I think it was the other way. Like, that's actually one of my favorite parts of the book, where like she talks about, the narrator talks about like, spraining your ankle almost on purpose, so you have an excuse to like express a feeling of pain. And so she's expressing her feeling of pain of hurting herself physically, because they will accept that, because it's physical pain. But she's also channeling all of this other anguish she has from like the loss of like the previous society and all that sort of shit. Like, that was a really cool and really freaky moment too. Like, people actively injuring themselves so they can actually kind of openly express themselves.
I think what makes the book like dangerous as well in that sense is that it's impossible to really tell who those like strange people like will be kind are. Like, you get people like the person who like offers her a ride. But then you also have the Miller as well, who's like almost like a sheep in wolf's clothing, right? So it's like alluring you in as well, and that just makes like trust that much more. If you can't trust anyone, you can't trust. Or wait, if you trust whatever it is.
Because I think that's a big part of like, I mean, and the trust aspect is basically, I guess, the difference between the friends that they seem to have. Although in the end, like I said, but then their trust is betrayed by that person who they don't realize in the end he's basically complicit, with the regime. But actually now I'm thinking about, that TV series, The Prisoner. Have you ever seen that one?
Oh yeah, the old one. I'm
Not a Number.
Yeah, when they're on the island.
Yeah, so that's from the 60s in the UK. But yeah, it's a really interesting kind of weird series as well. But I guess the thing is, because it's like, you could be in the Truman Show, you don't really know, what's actually real or who's actually involved. And so then, the character goes to like a party just with the neighbors to kind of keep up appearances. But they obviously don't trust them. But maybe the neighbors are okay, but they don't really know. And no one's willing to talk and risk like exposure. But I mean, it's the same thing happens around socials, right? I mean, but I guess you do sort of get a sense of people, and that's when you sort of, and I'm one of those people like who tries to quietly sort of support people in some ways too, where I see like, if I see an article, someone who's being genuinely critical, I'll basically send them a message and just say, hey, that's really great to read your review, saying that play was bad because no one dares to say that, like that sort of stuff. But it's hard to do it publicly.
I think I know what play you're talking about, but anyway.
Oh no, sorry, it's not just one play. There are a lot of these plays, and so I think, but I did feel kind of heartened by that aspect. Although I think in the end the book is a bit pessimistic, really, about the future of this, because basically they're being closed in on. And because now the state's getting involved and like those communes are being built and like, what was it like? There's like 19 houses, but there's only 20 of you or something. And so it just had that feeling. And that's why it reminded me of that film about the Polish artist under communism, how in the end he just had to die. Like, I can't remember how that ends exactly, but essentially that's why people commit suicide in the book. That's why people, willingly, take a stand because they know that they will get killed for it, because that's the only way they can think of to go.
I think it's maybe like kind of like a hopeless, or maybe like a hopeful like pessimism or cynicism as well. Because I feel like you can almost, and you see this in the different like artistic characters as well. If like the main thing they want to preserve is like communication, like and secrecy in that sense, particularly like the way of expressing a private vision in the way that might be expressing a secret or having a secret or containing a secret in an artwork itself. I feel like the book itself is like evidence of that hope. Maybe that like if this artwork continues to like maintain itself into the future, that itself is the resistance, right? Where even if your individual body or self is like taken over by the state or is taken over or it dies, right, it will pass on to the community. And so it works in the same way that like Kafka's story, like Josephine the Singer, works in that sense, and that the mouse folk will like carry on the story or carry on the hope of the story even after the like author of it dies or anything like that. And it reminds me of remember like Joshua Cohen was like asked about in an interview once because like about like Book of Numbers, about how in the age of the internet, like the best place to keep a secret is in a book itself because no one's going to read it. Right? It's like being able to use art as a form of like still like maintaining secrecy in that sense is like the prime thing. Like it particularly like, even with like the like modern senses, right? Like none of them actually read, right? So like it's the best place to like put something, right? Put it in a niche book where like the people who actually care will find like someday find it and read it. Just don't give them control of the publishing houses.
Yeah, that's quite a hopeful reading, I guess. And I guess that is the ultimate resistance. And I guess it's about the posterity, right?
But it's the posterity of the work itself at the expense of the individual, which is like that's the kind of hopeful pessimism that's like not necessarily clean in that sense, right?
I think those are all the main points that I had kind of thought of with the book. The book's not that long, so it's a good read actually, and that's why I read it twice. And so actually, like, I'm really grateful that I was asked to read this book because I hadn't heard about it otherwise. I could have missed it when it was re-released. But yeah, I just thought it was really helpful for thinking through my own kind of experiences and politics as well.
Yeah, like it's really interesting because it's quite slim, but there's a meatiness to it. Like, and even the style itself is like it's sort of like a spare style. It's all first person, and it's not really demanding in terms of a read. So it's short. The prose is competent and everything. Like, but
you're like damning with faint praise.
What's that?
No, you're damning with faint praise.
No. But because I think if it was overwritten, it wouldn't have the same effect. Like the unease comes from like the plainness of the things that are happening, like the dread of everything, like as it sort of escalates in a weird, not in a sort of like standard, 3-point plot way, but like it escalates in a way that's very, dread inducing and unsettling, which I think is great. And that only works because the language is so plain,
Yeah. And it's like how I said at the start, like how it works through like this weird sort of repetitious structure as well to the way that the language works. Like the same scenes, the same episodes start like over and over and over again. And you feel like they are just like variations on the same. Like that's why I don't know if it's like, I'm assuming these are like all different narrators, but all the narrators have the same voice, or it's like just the same. Like, are these all like the different characters in the same world, or are they just like, is this the same story told over and over and over again with like?
It's possible to read it that way. I mean, I assumed in the end it was basically the same person going through all these different experiences through different episodes of time. The other aspect too, actually, which in terms of the language, which I think worked for me, but you're right, Reuben, about the repetition, is the way that they would cite very concrete facts about nature. They're like, the sea is this color, the sky is that. But then it did make me think there was an authenticity to that too, because it was like living through lockdown. I don't know if you both had the same experience in Melbourne. Suddenly you've been walking around and you're like, oh, I've just noticed a dandelion for the first time. And then I was starting to look at all the weeds and suddenly realizing some of them were edible. But you would really kind of just like look at the very specific details of your life. And this is what it's like to live under pressure in that way. Like you don't have the same freedom. And something you do notice, like nature. So yeah, you started to notice like, there's aspects of nature which I think otherwise you might have just overlooked. I think there was real careful attention to detail around that, which to me it just made me think that it just felt very realistic because I mean that's what a lot of us experienced last year.
And I think like one of the important parts about the book that maybe we haven't actually touched on that much is like the role that memory plays as well. Like particularly early on, the characters are like insisting that, well, even though like all my books are being stolen, I've still got like, I need to make sure like I still remember like these Yeats poems, or I still need to remember these like Shakespeare sonnets or whatever. Because like so long as I have them like in my memory, no matter what they take from me, like it doesn't matter. Like they can take no matter what books they can take like the people away from me, so long as I have the memory. And like that's the shocking thing, like that whenever like a character comes back, they don't just lose their identity, they lose their memory. And like that's the thing that has to be like wiped. Because like memory is like where it's a reminder of like how things used to be. And if people still have a reminder of how things used to be, then they're still like in dread or fear, right? But if you don't have any memory of that, then you just acquiesce to the new state of things.
And how I read that too, it's not just about a memory of what used to be, it's just a memory of what was too, like in terms of, it made me think a bit again about, communist regimes, but even the current moment we're living in, where people are constantly trying to rewrite history, which I find really frustrating. It's like, you see like, on socials or whatever, the current discourse, like people who especially people who are young, who don't remember life before the internet or something, they essentially rewrite history in a way which doesn't even, accord with what actually happened. It's like, you're saying about Kay Dick, suddenly now she's kind of been described in a particular way. And we don't know, I mean, I don't know if that is the case that she was some, bisexual, radical, but maybe it's true or maybe it's not. But I feel like this kind of rewriting is sort of happening constantly. And unless you've kind of been around or actually have the details, that's what memory serves. Memory kind of tells you what the reality was as well.
And then people, and the reason that has happened as well is like partially going back to social media is that like, but people have memories of that. Like some things have like become memes and like historical facts now that are just completely inaccurate. Like the Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick at Stonewall, the black trans woman. One, it's unclear as to whether she identified as trans, and two, wasn't even there at the start. Like, and this is all being confirmed, but like, just because this was like proliferated on like Tumblr or somewhere, it's just like concretized into this like factoid that is not true. Like, so like rewriting the history then becomes like a kind of history in itself. And that's scary too.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, but you see this happen, like, throughout history. I mean, that's why you would burn books too, for one thing.
Yes.
You can erase records, like literally. But even like it's in the current moment, I see it happen quite a lot. I mean, and that's why I felt a particular responsibility as someone who is like a geriatric millennial, who's kind of old enough, who's been around, like, let's say, like in the local writing scene. I've seen it play out. I was very much there at the beginning, but because I didn't get too involved, I've kind of been able to maintain distance and memory about it all too. So that's why now if it's, I've actually seen literally pieces of writing that get published by some of our lit journals that essentially out-characterized as propaganda. Like it is actually not fact-checked. It is incorrect. It is factually inaccurate. It serves a political purpose and a very clear political agenda. And I guess I'm like, but ultimately, even though I have the memory, I'm still powerless to stop that kind of thing anyway. And the only way I can fight is to write an alternative account. But I've seen that happen many times where I'm like, actually, that's not what happened. You've actually misquoted someone too. That's not what they said. I mean, and this has happened throughout history. It's not just the local stuff. I mean, I guess this happens all the time where people suddenly realize that someone just fabricated a piece just to serve a particular agenda. And that's the power that I guess bad writing can, has as well, and why people perpetuate it, because there's a strong political aspect to it all.
Yeah. But one thing, we can't finish up without getting to the Guardian obituary, which
we can link it back. I mean, this is like the memorial, right? It's the memory.
Yeah, the memorial of. So this actually is quite funny. Like it lends a sense of bathos to the whole discussion in a way, because this obituary, which was published in 2001 when Kay Dick died, by Michael D. Lanois, is, I call it an obituary, because this guy is bitching about this woman and calling her a bitch essentially, and like talking about like how ungrateful she was to like people who helped her in the publishing industry, and how like kind of like how much of a slob and a mooch she was, and all this sort of shit. Like, it's actually amazing. Like, I don't think I've ever read an obituary like this, that it was so savage.
I haven't read it yet, actually. I have to read it after we talk.
You should get into it. Like, there's a couple of choice quotes. I didn't take any. Maybe Reuben did.
Well, there's so it sort of starts out like kind of okay, you know, it's just although the first, like the second sentence is, she expended far more energy in pursuing personal vendettas and romantic lesbian friendships than in writing books. But she will be remembered at least for her finest achievement, Pierrot, an investigation into the Commedia dell'arte, published in 1960. And then it's like, you know, pretty normal, although she has, like, of course, like mentioned that she was illegitimate. And then you get to rumor has it that she had accepted more than one commission to write biographies of Colette and Thomas Carlyle. When both subjects fell into the laps of more reliable authors, the belief that somehow her property had been purloined reached irrational proportions. Writer's block became her excuse, even for failing to turn in book reviews for the Times, The Spectator, and Punch, and friends and literary editors alike wrote her off as a lost cause. And it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Wow, an unreliable bisexual.
Yeah. And then you get, like, you know, it's not too bad. But her most vindictive act of vengeance was reserved for her prime bête noire, the biographer Joanna Richardson, whom she inelegantly labelled Old Jawbones. Farrell had no doubt that the novel had been excellently edited by Frances King, for, she noted in her best caustic manner, there were, quote, sentences with verbs in them and proper punctuation. But I love it. I love the description. And like Farrell was her lover, basically, for like most of her life. That's who Farrell was. But for many years, Dick lived in a basement flat on the Brighton seafront, just around the corner from Farrell, her like lover. Here, cigarettes, cream teas, and martinis were dispensed with a generosity that often belied her financial situations. In 1986, her debts amounted to more than £6,000, of which £3,000 was paid off with a gift from the Royal Literary Fund, despite the fact that when Frances King brought up her name, there were, quote, groans round the table.
So, yeah.
Because she had, like, no gratitude, apparently. Not content to find herself on Farrell's death, richer to the tune of some £65,000, Dick wasted several distasteful months, not to mention solicitors' bills, attempting to have disclosed the details of a secret clause in Farrell's will, permitting one of her executors, the novelist Sebastian Beaumont, to distribute small gifts to friends entirely at his own discretion. Her final folly lost her. This is the last paragraph, too, the last sentence. Her final folly lost her even the loyal friendship of Frances King, who had done more for her than anyone, and left a permanent sour reminder of a talented woman bedeviled by ingratitude and a kind of manic desire to avenge totally imaginary wrongs. K. Dick, novelist, born July 29, 2015, died October 19, 2005.
This like gives a whole other perspective to this novel too, doesn't it? Because it's like, what the hell? Like, is she? Are these just like people that are? Is she projecting in a way, like everyone who kind of is annoyed at her, like, and she's just sort of like being like, oh no, I'm an artist, I'm a nonconformist, so my behavior is above reproach, you know? Like, there's that reading.
It also makes, because the narrator, of course, is like will go in and out of houses, take things from.
But it's a really fascinating. I mean, yeah, it's a really savage obituary. So she obviously had a lot of enemies. But then, I mean, there's different ways. I mean, I don't know who this Michael Delanoy character is too, right? He probably was obviously he probably didn't like her very much for one thing. But I mean, but reading this, I mean, it also may not be totally fair either, right?
Yeah,
maybe
of course.
Maybe she's just a really difficult, complex woman. But I mean, but at the end of the day, I mean, I know lots of people like this in the world, but the proof is kind of in the writing as well, that I think she's written something that is, you know, pretty timeless, which I think is really interesting. So whether or not it's all imagined, you know, but obviously she was able to channel it into something constructive like this work.
Oh, definitely. It's like it's just like a cute little oddity though to have that obituary, like, you know, so fucking savage.
So savage. But
I don't know.
I think Brits are good at this sort of thing, to be honest. I think in Australia, you don't really write. People are scared of being this kind of honest about someone who's died, whereas I think in the UK they're really savage like this. But I have to say, I think I kind of like her a bit better even reading this. She just seems like really like she seems like a hot mess. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like just like living in Brighton, like
hot messes do make the best artists. I have to say, like
a true artist, right? Someone who's just not got her shit together exactly and just lived an unconventional life in some ways. But having said that, obviously, did desperately ask for money at different points too. So it wasn't like they were completely self-sufficient.
Yeah. If only she got republished while she was still alive. I wonder how well this book is doing, actually. I've seen it all over the place. So
done pretty well. I mean, just looking at using a very bad metric, like the Goodreads, there's like over 1,000 Goodreads reviews and like ratings on it. So I feel like that's not bad for a reissued book. I can't imagine many of them would have come before the book was reissued.
Right? Sorry.
No, I was going to say, but I do wonder how regular people might read a book like this. Like, because I mean, I think I read a particular way as someone who's like involved, but I don't know if other people might just kind of think it just seems like, what's this about really? It doesn't seem to like, it's more like, if you know, and you read this sort of thing and it's very inside baseball, whereas I'm not sure it would do well with the general public. It's not quite as branded. Yeah, it's not like 1984 or something like that, where that's just like, like quite epic really, and people and everyone's affected by that in some ways, where this is a little bit more niche, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, you do know. If you know, you know, and if you know, you should pick it up because it's actually a really great book. I really enjoyed it. And it literally, I just randomly chose it and then was like, "Hey Sheila, do you want to read this?" And I had no idea it would have such resonance with you. So
no, it was like so fortuitous because I was like, how did you know that this was my life? Like that this is what I've been living. Although in the end, I guess ultimately I'm not exactly like this because obviously like I'm married with 2 kids. So I like a much more conventional seeming life. But there were definitely so many elements which I thought this seemed truthful. So even though she might be like, according to this obituary, like a massive narcissist, which may also be true. I mean, ultimately multiple things can be true, right? She could also be a great artist and also a massive narcissist, but also someone who actually had experiences with other people bullying her too. Like I think those things probably all are correct.
Definitely. Any last thoughts on the book from either of you? No? Thank you so much, Sheila, for joining us today. It was wonderful.
It was fun. Thanks so much for having me on.